the historical genealogy, first wave feminism was related to the concept of voting rights, okay? So we call women's suffrage. So by 1920s, in this country, they were given voting rights, but even that, it wasn't perfect, okay? So 1920s, most states said, okay, women can now vote. Although some states had said that the condition is that they have to own property, the problem is that the states didn't allow them to own property. So even the voting rights that were given, they were given in a very kind of loose way, right? And I always find this interesting, this is what I mentioned in the khutbah, is that political participation for women, and I know it's not the exact same when we talk about democratic participation, but women's suffrage actually comes 1,400 years late. Because when it came to political participation, the Prophet ﷺ actually took bay'ah, took an oath of allegiance, not only from the men, but also from the women, right? You remember when Hind comes to the Prophet ﷺ and she's complaining about her husband, Abu Sufyan, being stingy. When she came to him, that incident, the particular occurrence happens when she's coming to pledge the oath of allegiance, right? To give the bay'ah to the Prophet ﷺ, right? Now again, I know it's not the same democracy, that's not what I'm talking about, but I'm saying that whole concept of political engagement or having political participation, they were very late to do that. So first wave feminism, second wave feminism tries to deals with the concept of gender roles. If a man can do it, why can't a woman do it? All right? And this is a major faux pas because they have mixed the idea of equality of value and identicality of roles, right? And when you mix that up, what starts to happen? You start saying, well, if a man can work, I can work, right? If a man can do this, we should be able to do this. Okay, now let's ask the question. Should the standard be man? Because man is weak. Man has limitations. Or should the standard come from that which transcends man's weakness, the male weakness, which is Allah, right? So now the standard becomes, if a man does this, we're going to do this. Where is there a problem? In the realm of biology, right? So now you have the advent, like 1960, you have the birth control pill, that gets instituted, the FDA approves it, 1973, Roe versus Wade, okay? Abortion becomes legalized. All of that happens because of this major mistake between mixing of equality of value, identicality of roles. This entire concept, and I've entered into the conversation of liberalism, so I'll conclude this quickly. This entire concept that we are hammered with, all men are created equal. That is an assumption of liberalism. Any worldview will not even be able to justify that. So remember we talked about philosophical naturalism? How do you justify human beings being created equal biologically? We're not. In fact, you justify the exact opposite. We are unequal, right? That's the whole concept of survival of the fittest and all of that. You have to have an unequal, biology to be able to survive and evolution take place. So that assumption of every human is equal from a philosophical naturalistic worldview, you can't substantiate it, right? And in essence, we are not. That is not the state of nature. We are not identical. We have different heights and weights and intellectual ability. That's not the case. But is our value equal? In that case, we could say yes. And why we can say that with confidence is because our value, as we mentioned, comes from that which transcends limited mind and human emotion, which is Allah, right? If someone were to equate value to the human being and say God doesn't exist, how would you substantiate that, right? Like we spoke about, was it yesterday, I think, okay? So anyways, that was my tirade on this question, so my apologies. It's one of the things I'm dealing with more nowadays. Okay. Let's go ahead and start with our next topic, inshallah. And that is basically, whoa, that's going a little fast. What we've termed linguistic miracle of the Qur'an for non-Arabic speakers. Okay, so what is the goal of this section is that we're going to provide a case where we want to say that the Qur'an is from Allah. Now, one of the contentions that people may come up with, because you say, look, if you read the Qur'an and you know Arabic, you will be able to see by way of your reading and by way of appreciating the linguistic nuances, all of those things, you will come to the conclusion that it is from Allah, all right? Or when it comes to the idea of contradictions, right? So sometimes someone will come up with they'll try to throw a contradiction at you, and one of the responses is, well, you're taking two translations of the Qur'an and coming up with a contradiction, but they're different things that we're talking about here. So the contention is, well, I don't know Arabic, so isn't that unfair of God to want me to find a contradiction but not allow me to have the tools to find the contradiction? Do you get where this contention comes up for? And other areas, right? So bring a Qur'an like it. Well, why does it have to be in Arabic? And so that would necessitate I have to learn Arabic. And so therefore God is unfair because I speak English and, I have this idea of absolute Americanism and English is the best language in the world, whatever, right? Like, why should I learn another language? All of that comes into play. Okay. So in response to that, this is what we're going to be speaking about. How to show the Qur'an is from Allah without reference to the Arabic language, okay? So here's the structure of the argument, all right? Now it's divided into two broad categories. One category is what we call inimitability, all right? And the second category is authorship. So the first category of inimitability is we're talking about the fact that the Qur'an cannot be emulated or imitated. The second category is we're asking the question, who is the author of the Qur'an? And this will also come about as a deductive argument, all right? We will have options. So for instance, we're going to say there's only a few limited options in terms of who authored the Qur'an. Either it was Allah, either it was the Prophet ﷺ, either it was an Arab, or either it was a non-Arab. There's no fifth option, right? So if you can eliminate three of those options and leave Allah as the only option, deductively you have shown that the author of the Qur'an is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all right? So let's take a look at the structure of the argument in detail now, bi'idhnillah, okay? Number one, so here's the points. The Qur'an presents a literary and linguistic challenge to humanity, right? Bring a Qur'an like it, bring 10 surahs like it, bring an ayah like it, so on and so forth. You're all familiar with this, right? Surah Al-Baqarah in different places, okay? Number two, the 7th century Arabs were best placed to challenge the Qur'an, okay? So the Qur'an comes down at a language and a specific epoch and a specific spatial boundary, which is 7th century Hijaz, 7th century Arabian Peninsula. So if we understand how languages work and that they change over time, we say the best people equipped to deal with that challenge is going to be people at that epoch in that place, okay? And we'll get into more details about that. Number three, what we're going to see is those people failed to meet the challenge, okay? Number four, scholars have testified to the Qur'an's inimitability. We'll get into a little bit about the concept of testimony. And five, counter-scholarly testimonies are not plausible as they have to reject established background information. We'll get into all of these things. Right now we're just presenting the structure of the argument. If we've understood 1 through 5, we will say that the Qur'an is inimitable, right? You cannot emulate it. You cannot bring a Qur'an like it, okay? So now, the possible explanation for the Qur'an's inimitability are authorship by an Arab, non-Arab, the Prophet ﷺ, or Allah. Again, in a deductive format, it could not have been, so the conclusion is, it could not have been produced by an Arab, non-Arab, or the Prophet ﷺ. Therefore, the best explanation is that it's from God. That is the structure of the argument, all right? This is where we're going to get into a lot of details. So I need you to pay attention and give me your full focus, inshallah. Okay. Let's start with the intellectual challenge, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِّمَّا نَزَّلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِّثْلِهِ. Right? So if you are in doubt about what we have sent down to our servant, then bring a chapter like it, right? وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ, and enlist whatever helpers, supporters that you have other than Allah, if you truly think you can. The challenge is what? If you're in doubt, bring a Qur'an like it. Okay? Everyone clear about the challenge? Right? The tahaddi? Okay. So, let's look at some of the views related to this challenge. Or let's look at some views about the Qur'an. Some testimonial references. So, Bruce Lawrence, in his book, The Qur'an, A Biography, he writes, as tangible signs, Qur'anic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning layered with meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. Imam Fakhr ad-Din, right, and this is cited in Al-Itqan fil Ulum al-Quran, he says it is inimitable because of its eloquence, its unique style, and because it is free of error. Okay, now these are just testimonies. All right, H.A.R. Gibb, very famous historian. Like all Arabs, they were connoisseurs of language and rhetoric. Well, then, if the Qur'an were his own composition, other men could rival it. Let them produce 10 verses like it. If they could not, and it is obviously that they could not, then let them accept the Qur'an as an outstanding evidential miracle. All right, now, there are some... Okay, so what are we saying now? Number one, we're saying that the Arabs were the best place to challenge the Qur'an. Right? Why is that the case? Why that's the case is because the 7th century Arabs achieved linguistic mastery over the Arabic language. All right? So as Ibn Rashid mentions, he says the Arabs used to congratulate each other only on the birth of a child or when a poet rose amongst them. Language in that particular environment was the main tool of pretty much anything. Your status was based on how eloquent you are, how well-versed you are with the language, how articulate you were, and so on and so forth, right? So the experts within the Arabic language of that time period were the Arabs of that time period, okay? And that is well known by way of testimony, okay? All right. So if we understand that they had achieved linguistic mastery at that time, all right? And we know this because of testimonial knowledge, which we'll talk about in a little bit. If that is the case, did the Arabs at the time of the Prophet ﷺ meet the challenge? That's the question, all right? Now, what we're going to look at is that we know that they didn't meet the challenge from a few epistemic tools that we've been talking about, okay? One is that they didn't meet the challenge based on testimonial knowledge, which we said was fundamental to epistemology, all right? We said how you know what you know, most of that comes from the say-so of others. As we mentioned with a lot of detail, we spoke about how do you know your mother is your mother, how do you know the world is round. We said that without testimony, those are things that you cannot know, right? So there's testimony, but then there's also the idea of historicity, okay? And we'll get into that in just a second. Okay, so before we get there, let's understand testimony and let's understand inference. These are two philosophical concepts. Testimony, I think we've covered in quite some detail. So we've already said that it is a valid and indispensable source of knowledge. We asked the question, whether it was yesterday or day before yesterday, I'm blurring now, right? Is the world flat? All right? So by the way, how many people were here yesterday? Okay, so most of you were. Okay. So yesterday, if you want to remind us, how did this particular idea of the world being flat, what does that have to do with testimony? What were we trying to show yesterday? And let me get you a mic, inshallah.
Basically, you said that we know the world is not flat because other people have told us that it's not flat.
Right, so we know the world is round,
yeah.
But the challenge was that, and this is the challenge I made to everyone, can you know that the world is round without reference to testimony, without knowledge from the say-so of somebody else, right? And we know that no one has flown out of the earth, at least in this room. So therefore, you are dependent upon the say-so of somebody else, right? The pictures that you see of the world being round, you didn't take that picture. You have to trust the one that took the picture, right? We asked the question about, how do you know your mother's your mother? And the only way you know that is by way of testimony, right? And I think someone mentioned like a picture. And I was like, wow, someone actually took a picture. That's interesting. But anyways, but even the picture, you'd have to trust the person who took the picture. So a fundamental part of how you know, in fact, I would argue most of what you know comes from testimonial knowledge. It is an indispensable source of knowledge. If you did not have testimony, most of what you know, you wouldn't know. Okay? Fundamentally. All right. So now we want to explore some academic testimonies, and then we'll say that why there's counter-testimonies, right? In terms of the inimitability of the Qur'an. So let's look at testimony. Well, these are some quotes about testimony. Concerned with how we acquire knowledge and justified belief from the say-so of other people. Many of us have neither seen a baby born, nor have most of us examined the circulation of the blood. Yet, we know that the blood circulates by way of reference of somebody else, right? Of writings or whatever it might be. Okay. All right, so fundamental testimony is fundamental. We've already spoken about this, and there's other references you can look at. So Dr. Elizabeth Fricker, she actually studies testimony and epistemology in quite some detail. She has a lot of lectures on YouTube. You can check it out. She talks about epistemic limitations, right? So for instance, we know we have epistemic limitations and we rely on the skills of other people, is what her area of expertise is, because we understand that we cannot know everything. And we expand our epistemic limits by the knowledge and say-so of other people, right? So she gives examples of, I'm not a mechanic, I take my car to the mechanic, I rely on that mechanic's knowledge. If I'm not a doctor, I rely on the knowledge of the doctor, and thus I've expanded my epistemic limitations, right? So Dr. Elizabeth Fricker, she speaks about that. Keith Lair, he has some work on testimony and trustworthiness, if you're interested. And there's another one by Benjamin McMyler on the right to referral. The reason I'm mentioning these resources, the academic resources, is because when you're having a conversation with someone, you know, they may think that like testimony is just something that's, you know, that's just a weak way of acquiring knowledge. When in fact, philosophically, it has a profound importance in how you know what you know, right? And so it's good to kind of read some of the references from Western academia itself, inshallah. Okay. All right, so we already talked about that. Let's take a look at some academic testimonies about the Qur'an. All right, so notwithstanding, so this is Shah Waliullah Delwi, rahimahullah, in Al-Fawz Al-Kabir fi Rasul Al-Tafsir. By the way, do you guys study that text here? For those of you, there's no seventh year students here. No, okay, anyway, khair, inshallah. So notwithstanding the literary excellence of some of the long pre-Islamic era poems, the Qur'an is definitely on a level of its own as the most eminent written manifestation of the Arabic language. All right, that's just testimony. Naved Karmani, Poetry and Language, he writes, obviously the Prophet ﷺ succeeded in this conflict with the poets, otherwise Islam would not have spread like wildfire. Okay, so now let's take a look at this. Well, so we have testimonies. Now someone's going to argue, okay, just because someone said it doesn't mean it's true. Obviously you're going to have counter testimonies, right? Simply saying someone said it and therefore it's true, that's not what we're saying. We're saying when you look at the testimonies, we have testimonies that are showing and stating that the Qur'an was inimitable, right? And we just read some of them. We also have counter testimonies, okay? Point being is if you can negate the counter testimonies, the testimonies for the Qur'an being inimitable stand. Does that make sense? Okay? So let's get through some of the counter testimonies, right? So, number one, we'll look at absurd. When we look at counter testimonies, we'll see that there are absurd implications. In order for those counter testimonies to stand, to be valid, they have to reject all of or most or a big section of Arabic literary history. All right? They would also need to claim greater linguistic ability than the 7th century Arab linguists, and they'd have to deny the challenge of the Qur'an. All right? So, let's take a look at these one at a time. What do I mean by absurd implications? What I mean is the challenge that comes up in Surah Al-Baqarah, it comes up at a certain epoch of time, right? So this is after the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ, okay? And this is around the time of the Battle of Badr, right? So we know this. Now, this challenge has come, and it's come to the Arabs. If you think about this, does it seem plausible that someone could meet the challenge because they have all of the linguistic tools to do so, and they are the only ones that have the linguistic tools to do so, as we're going to see, meet the challenge and not go to war? Or does it make sense to say, you know what, let's go to war instead of meeting the challenge? Because remember, war is expensive. There are economic implications. You lose a lot of money. You lose life. It is difficult. No one likes war. Human beings don't want to go fight and have the chance of dying. Does it make sense to say, instead of meeting the challenge, the Arabs said, let's go to war? Does that make sense? It is absurd to think so, okay? So we know that the Arabs didn't meet the challenge because if they had met it, or if they had done that, they wouldn't have gone to war. It is absurd to think so. Now, someone may say, okay, you're saying that the Arabs went to war. How do we know that? That goes to the second point. If you say that that never occurred, you have to reject all of Arabic literary history, meaning whatever history comes out of that time period, you have to reject it all. But if you're going to reject that, you have to reject any sort of historical methodology in any sphere of any history. That is also absurd. Okay? So now, the other counter testimony would be, okay, yeah, go ahead. Let's get the mic, yeah.
Yeah, so I understood the point about rejecting the Arabic literary history, but then I also had a question because I've seen this a lot of times, especially at university, where a lot of, like, I believe misguided people would write down, like, when talking about Islamic literary history as, quote, Islamic legends. As in, like, they just dismiss everything, the entire tradition, as just a quote-unquote legend or a fable.
Sure.
How do you respond to that kind of blatant lie?
You respond by saying, just be consistent. If you're going to reject Arabic literary history, you have to reject all literary history, right? Because, again, what tools do you have for the preservation of that history? If you study history within Western academia, within academic institutions, the methodology of how you preserve history, right? Historiography, in fact, is much weaker than how we have preserved history, right? So you have not only, in addition to the history, you have the hadith tradition, which has a very robust, sophisticated system, and that is not how historians within the Western framework or academic framework work. So you have a system, in fact, that is stronger. So if you're going to reject that system, your weaker system, by necessity, you have to reject it. So you can't say anything about any history from that perspective, right? I mean, even go back 200 years, maybe you have, like, let's say, the Constitution, but then how do you know, again, if you're going to go down that route of radical skepticism, well, how do you know Thomas Jefferson, XYZ, penned the Declaration of Independence or whatever it might be, right? That's why I'm saying it's absurd, right? The implications are absurd. And so if you're going to say that, just be consistent. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
Yeah. So can we get the mic over there?
Assalamu alaikum. Not to go down a rabbit hole, but as Muslims, obviously, we readily accept or can appreciate the fact that the 7th century Arabs were the most qualified to accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's challenge.
Sure.
But if I'm a regular atheist today, they would have a huge problem with that, because they would say, as a society based on testimonial knowledge or experiential knowledge or culmination of everything that we've learned as a society,
Sure.
it must be true that some people should be at least equal or more qualified than the 7th century Arabs, because the 7th century Arabs were very simple people. So why is it that, how do we prove to them that the 7th century Arabs actually were the most qualified to take on that challenge? And also,
Okay, so I'm going to get to that in a second, but okay.
Okay. And then the second part, and this may be a dumb argument, but they might say, because we do know that there are people that attempted it, right? They did come up with
We're going to get to that as well.
garbage surahs or whatever they.
So hold on to that,
Okay.
because once I'm done, I think that'll clarify that. Okay.
Exactly.
Right now we're just wayak. So right now we're just saying that if we're going to say that the challenge wasn't met and the alternative was going to war, you'd have to say, you know what? Either you're going to have to reject all of Arabic literary history, but then you have to be consistent in that, right? Because no one chooses war over just simply meeting a challenge and calling it a day. It just doesn't make sense, right? Okay. What? Okay. Well, whatever you want to call them, I'm not going to get into that. Okay. Now, the third aspect of this counter testimony is that you'd have to claim greater linguistic ability than the 7th century Arab linguists. Problem is, when you study the philosophy of language, and we understand that languages change over time, okay? This is something that's well known. The English we speak today is not the English that was spoken 200 years ago, okay? The Arabic that's spoken today is not the Arabic that was spoken at the time of the Prophet ﷺ in the 7th century, okay? And for anyone who speaks Arabic, you know this very well. The Ammiya, is very different than Fusha, okay? Now, the question is, if we understand that there is the Arabic language of the 7th century, and we understand that the Arabs of the 7th century were the ones that spoke the language, that lived the language, that knew the language, right? When a person makes a claim that we can now meet the challenge, they would have to say, I can have greater linguistic ability than those people. Does everyone understand this point? Okay. Why is that a problem? Because from that period of time, there's a relative homogeneity. In other words, the Arabs did not necessarily go out en masse until Islam comes, right? They were relatively an insular community. Civilizations came by, said, yo, that's hot, I'm not going to deal with that, who cares about the desert? And they kept going, right? So they were relatively insular. They celebrated the language, as we said, by way of our testimonial knowledge. Language was celebrated. It was a major occupation and preoccupation, right? In and out. So language was very, very important to their society. Now, because they're living in a homogeneous environment, you don't find linguistic depreciation. Until Islam comes, wars happen, and Islam starts to spread. That is when you find that, okay, hold on a second, the language has now started to change. And that is why many of the people of the time, very early on amongst the Sahaba, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Umar ibn Khattab, saw this immediately and started saying, we have to preserve the way to understand the language. That's why the stuff you study now, the Nahu, the Sarf, the Balagha, all that stuff that you guys are enjoying studying, that has to do with an understanding that the language is now changing and we need to establish a normative standard of the language. Otherwise, this is going to be problematic. Okay? That being the case, if someone is going to say that the challenge has been met, number one, we understand the challenge was not met by the connoisseurs, the main experts of the language at that time. Everyone who is outside of that epoch, who comes afterwards, cannot claim the same linguistic ability. So by default, you don't have the tools to meet the challenge. Does that make sense? Everyone understand that? Okay. Can I get to the last point? Let me finish and then I'll open up for questions, okay? Okay, so when we deny the challenge of the Qur'an, or when people deny the challenge of the Qur'an, they're only left with a certain number of options. So again, they would have to have absurd implications, right? By rejecting Arabic literary history, they would have to claim greater linguistic ability than the 7th century Arab linguists. Let me add to this a little bit. Number one, you're talking about the epoch of time and language depreciating over time, okay? The other aspect is that even the people that are trying to, let's say, well, actually, I'm going to park that discussion. What was your question? Go ahead and get on the mic.
Not to go down a messy rabbit hole, but again, I'm thinking from the perspective of somebody who doesn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, somebody who lives in an English-speaking country.
Sure.
He would say, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided this challenge and then he limited the parameters of the challenge such that I'm at a huge disadvantage being 1400 years later,
Sure.
that's a very unfair challenge, and it just doesn't sound convincing to them. Whereas,
Well, so there's two things here. The morality of the challenge, which is a separate conversation, right? So we say, look, you know what? Hang on to your morality question. We'll get to that when we talk about objective morals. Okay, that's a separate question, right? The argument itself stands whether you think it's moral or immoral, right? Because now we're conflating.
no, I'm not talking about morality. I'm just
No, you are, because you're saying, well, that wouldn't be fair. That's a moral statement. It's not fair for God to give a challenge and then not give you that's a moral question, right?
Yes, but then that would basically suggest that if there's this God that you believe in that's supposed to be all just and fair,
Right.
you, Mr. Muslim, just proved that your God is not fair.
Well, these are two separate conversations, right? We can get to that conversation, that's fair, but right now we're just talking about the authorship of the Qur'an, right? We'll get to that topic. We can talk about that, but just park it. Let me get through my point, and then we'll talk about is it fair, is it not fair, and how do we understand morals and meta ethics, and we can talk about all those things. But that's not what I'm arguing here. And in fact, all I'm saying is who authored the Qur'an. That's it, right? Now, if it's unfair, fine. I'll give it to you. Okay, it's unfair. God is unfair. Fair enough. But still, right, what I'm trying to show is that the Qur'an is from Allah, right? If you want to say he's unfair, for now, I'll give it to you. Take it.
Just one little tidbit. For the people that actually attempted it, what was the reference point? Who made the decision that you did come up with a bunch of verses that sounds like the Quran or better than the Quran? Who was the authority to say, yes, you met the challenge or you didn't?
I mean, the Arabs of the 7th century. Had they met the challenge, right, they wouldn't have gone to war.
So it was more of a communal thing.
Of course. Language is a part of what we call social ontology. Okay? It has to be communal. Just like money is part of social ontology, it has to be communal, right? Like everyone has to have some sort of kind of an unspoken social contract to accept currency, right? Is part of what we call social ontology. Language works the same way, right? It has to be communal. Like in order for us to communicate, we all have to have some sort of, whether it's direct or indirect, understanding that this word means this. So it's not about an authority, it's about, well, this is part of the communal like nature of how language works.
So last part, I apologize, and I'm taking a lot of time. If an Orientalist today comes back and says, I read Shakespeare and this sounds more beautiful and more magnificent than the translation of Abdullah Ali of the Quran.
Yeah, so
how do we,
again, let's just park that, right? Because that's not even part of our argument about how the Quran sounds, right? That's not what we're arguing. We're not saying that it's from Allah because it sounds good, right? That's not even part of the argument. Yes, can you get the mic, inshallah?
Bismillah. May Allah make it easy.
I mean,
so basically, I think the selection was not only based on the language, because Allah select Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a Mustafa, and He said, "وما أرسلناك إلا رحمة للعالمين." When Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that إنما بعثت لأتمم مكارم الأخلاق. So basically, the selection was based the akhlaq first, and Allah select the best human in akhlaq.
Sure.
And also the society for the Arab at that time, they consider akhlaq is really important.
Sure.
So it was language and manner and akhlaq.
Sure.
So I think that's can answer brother question or assumption about the language.
Perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps.
I'll have to think about that. I don't know. Okay, let's get back to the structure of the argument, and maybe some of those things will be clarified. If not, then we'll move on, inshallah. Okay, let's move on. So we have to talk about inference now. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about testimony. Let's move on to inference. Now, what do we mean by inference? So inference, Peter Lipton defines it as such. So he says the doctor infers, the doctor infers that his patient has measles since this is the best explanation of the evidence before him. The astronomer infers that the existence of the motion of Neptune, since that is the best explanation of the observed perturbations of Uranus. Given our data and our background beliefs, we infer what we would, if true, provide the best of the competing explanations we can generate of those data. Now, I'm going to kind of summarize what he says and kind of explain what he says, okay? We, as human beings, use inference to the best explanations to come to conclusions, okay? What do I mean by inference? And what do we mean inference to the best explanation? Let's assume now, do you guys have tackies here? Talkies? Those really, you guys have that here? Okay. Maybe I'll make it easy for you. Anyway, so I personally, I can't stand them, not necessarily because how they taste, but just that orange nastiness that comes up on your fingers is terrible, right? Anyway, my son loves them, all right? My second-born, Abdurrahman, he's huge. And so imagine now that we buy a number of bags of tacky chips, okay? These tackies or takis, I think ikhtilaf on how to pronounce it. But anyway, I'll go with Takis, okay? We buy a whole bunch of bags because we're having guests over, and I tell Abdurrahman, I say, look, these Takis, I'm putting them in the pantry. Don't touch them, okay? But because Abdurrahman is Abdurrahman, and if you know my son, yeah, you know, he really wants those Takis, right? Anyways, so I told him, I said, look, Abdurrahman, don't touch the Takis. Don't even think about it. Don't even look at them, okay? Otherwise, you're going to be in deep trouble, okay? Now, I come back like an hour later, and I see Abdurrahman. He's on the couch, and he's passed out, all right? And he's lying down, and I see his fingers, and they're totally orange. And you see this orange, that grossness that comes from the chips all over his mouth too, all right? And I see that there's this trail of that orange nastiness that goes right into the pantry. And I see an open bag of chips. All right. Here's the thing. There are actually a few explanations of this. All right. Explanation number one. My older son, Abdullah, he said, you know what? This is a great opportunity to really stick it to Abdurrahman. Okay? So basically, he took Abdurrahman, knocked him out, threw him on the couch, crushed up some Takis, put it on his mouth, put it on his fingertips, had the path all the way, opened the bag of Takis, and left it like that. And he's like, ha, 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 right? Explanation number one. Explanation number two. Abdurrahman really wanted those chips. He went in, opened the bag, ate it, and kept on eating it until the couch and then passed out. All right? Two explanations. Which is the more likely explanation? Right? The second one. That is what we call inference to the best explanation. When you have competing explanations, you infer the best one. Does that make sense? That's essentially what he's saying. Doctors do this all the time. They have a number of competing explanations. They infer to the best explanation. Make sense? Okay, good. Okay, now, that being the case, what we're going to say is that the inference to the best explanation... Okay, go ahead. Let's get the mic over there. And while you're doing that, actually, after you do that, I'm going to ask the sisters if they have a question. Go ahead.
In that example, how do you know which explanation is the best explanation?
Well, what do you think? How do you think? As a father, how would I...
Which I'm not.
I mean, would you go with explanation number one?
Probably number two.
Number two, okay. So then why? It's an inference, right? You inferred based on previous historical experience and so on and so forth. There's a number of information and background and all these things, your experience as a father, blah, 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 blah. All of that leads to you saying, okay, this is the best explanation, right? And like I say, doctors do this based on their background knowledge. They say, okay, we have these particular symptoms or whatever it might be, but based on our background knowledge, we know that we infer that this is the best explanation, okay? So what we're saying here is that the inference we're making is that, look, you could say that all of Arabic literary history was just total, nonsense, but we've already debunked that. But even when you look at it from the inference of the best explanation, the inference is that the Arabs were not able to meet the challenge, okay? Even if you entertain other explanations. But because we work with a process of inference, we've inferred that. And we've shown that counter testimonies are categorically untrue. Why? Because to infer them would be problematic. It leads to absurd implications. All right? Is that clear so far? Everyone understand inference? Everyone's down with testimony? We're good? Okay, let's move on. Okay, so where are we? So if you remember the structure of the argument, we said there are two parts: inimitability, authorship. Okay? So what we're saying, what we've covered so far, we've covered point one: the Qur'an presents a literary and linguistic challenge to humanity. Bring a Qur'an like it. The 7th century Arabs were best placed to challenge the Qur'an. We've covered why. The 7th century Arabs failed to do so. We said, why do we know this, right, in the sense of testimonies and counter-testimonies. Then we said scholars have testified to the Qur'an's inimitability. We gave some of those testimonies. Counter-scholarly testimonies are not plausible. We mentioned that why they're not plausible. And so what we've said now, therefore, based on 1 to 5, that the Qur'an is inimitable. Okay? That's all we've established. We haven't established who the author is. All we've established was that the challenge was not met. In other words, it was not met. Okay, so that's clear so far? So far, so good? Okay, good. let's move on to the authorship. All right? All right, so now let's look at the first option. So we have a few options here. Either the Qur'an, right, in terms of, okay, we've established it's inimitable, but there's only a few options. Either it came from an Arab authored it, or a non-Arab, or the Prophet ﷺ, or it came from Allah. Is there any other options? Yes. Sorry? An alien. Okay. So then I'd refer you back to philosophical naturalism. Again, if you're going to make absurd, okay, it could have been an alien, but then it could be a lot of things, right? Well, we're saying, based on inference, right, there are only 4 plausible explanations, right? The authorship can only be in one of these 4. If you want to add aliens, that's going to be a bit... Aliens could go under non-Arab, sure. I like that. Jazakallah khair. Unless they were Arab aliens. All right. Anyway, so the multiverse and all that, right? Okay, anyway. Okay, so let's move on. So, based on a deductive form of the argument, we're saying that it could only have been an Arab, non-Arab, the Prophet ﷺ, or Allah. So now let's test all of these one by one. Okay, number 1. Could it have been an Arab? We've already shown that it was not an Arab of the 7th century. Okay, so for instance, Walid ibn Mughira, right, one of the worst, most vicious enemies of Islam, he says, he's quoted as saying, "For what can I say? For I swear by Allah, there is none amongst you who knows poetry as well as I do, nor can any compete with me in composition or rhetoric, not even in the poetry of the jinn. And yet I swear by Allah, Muhammad's speech," he's referring to the Qur'an, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "does not bear any similarity to anything I know, and I swear by Allah, the speech that he says is very sweet, and it is adorned with beauty and charm." Okay? Now this is one testimony. There are multiple testimonies, right? So we understand that the Arabs of that time did not meet the challenge because we have testimony from that time, and because of Arab literary history. Again, they would not have gone to war if they felt they met the challenge. Okay? So, could it have been an Arab? Meaning, could it have been an Arab of the 7th century? Let's qualify that. No. Could it have been an Arab that came after the 7th century? Why? The linguistic tools, right? If the language is now depreciated, right, outside of that particular epoch of time, if an Arab of the 7th century who has all of the linguistic tools, right, and are connoisseurs of language, at the apex was not able to meet the challenge, how can an Arab who lives outside of that apex or that epoch meet the challenge? So someone who lives in, let's say, Syria or Jordan or Saudi or whatever today, they don't have the linguistic tools, right? So linguistically, as we said, languages depreciate. We know that very clearly, okay? So therefore, could it have been an Arab of that time or of modern day? Yes? No? Where are we, people? Okay, no. It's very light, kind of like, no. like, unless someone has doubts based on what we've said. So, yes or no? No. Okay. Could it have been a non-Arab? That's even more problematic, right? Why? Because not only is there a problem of language depreciating, but now Arab becomes a second language. And for those who study second languages, they are never as good as your mother tongue, ever, no matter how much you study it. I can tell you from someone who's been studying Arabic for a long time, I will never, ever, ever be able to match someone in terms of my, let's say, muhadatha and things like that, how I speak, with someone who has been born in an Arab household, has spoken it their entire life. It will never happen, right? So for a non-Arab, if an Arab can't meet that challenge, most definitely someone who has Arabic as a second language, even if you consider they've studied the grammar and all those things, they wouldn't be able to meet the challenge either. Make sense? Okay. Could it have been the Prophet ﷺ? Okay, well, logically, he was an Arab, so That settles that, okay? Because he's in the category of being an Arab, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But now, kind of just in terms of some bolstering evidence, right? So this is not, so the primary thing is he was an Arab, and so we already said it couldn't have been an Arab, okay? But also, there's the point about after their initial accusations, the Arab linguists never accused him of being the author. So not only was it that he's in the category of being an Arab, he was never accused by the 7th century Arabs of being the author. Number two, the Qur'an is a literary masterpiece, right? And when you go back to, did the Prophet ﷺ have any sort of evidence of poetry before the Qur'an, you don't find any sort of evidence of that, okay? In terms of he was not known as a poet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's also what we call psycholinguistic content, all right? Let's take a look at that. So there's a study that was done, and again, this is bolstering evidence. This is not, I'm not saying this is the reason why it couldn't have been the Prophet ﷺ. We've already said logically, he was an Arab. We already said Arabs couldn't have emulated it. This case is solved. We're just giving a bolstering study, something additional, right, to drive the point home. So there was a literary study that was done, okay? And in this study, let me give you some background to it. They analyzed the entire Qur'an and the entire words and grammatical structures of the Qur'an. And they took hadith literature and analyzed all of the words and grammatical structures of hadith literature and then compared how similar they are, okay? They had certain qualities and certain parameters by which they tried to match how similar is the speech, the two types of speech, okay? So, results of all experiments have led to two main conclusions. First, the two investigated books, here I think they're referring to Sahih al-Bukhari and the Qur'an, should have different authors. Number two, all segments that are extracted from a unique book appear to have a certain stylistic similarity. So elements within the Qur'an are stylistically similar. Elements within Sahih al-Bukhari are stylistically similar. Okay? So consequently, we conclude, according to this investigation, that the Qur'an was not written by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and that it belongs to a unique author. In other words, when they looked at how much similarity there is between how the language is structured in the Qur'an and how much it is structured, how it is structured within, let's say, a hadith, they said that, for instance, similarities range from, let's say, 32%. Okay? Now, 32% is not conclusive to say this is the author of this book. In other words, most of the language was different. The structure of the language, how things were put, and so on and so forth. Vocabulary was different. The vocabulary of the Qur'an, unless the Prophet ﷺ was quoting the Qur'an, was different. Okay? Anyways, this is just a study. You can check it out. It's called Author Discrimination Between the Holy Qur'an and the Prophet's Statements. Halim's Sayyid, Literary and Linguistic Computing, Volume 27, Number 4. You can check that out, inshallah. Okay. Now, someone said, as you had mentioned, what about Shakespeare, right? Now, one of the problems that arises when we're comparing Shakespeare is that Shakespeare had the benefit of editing. He could go back, edit, come back, reformulate, go back. The issue with the Qur'an is that there's no concept of editing. When an ayah comes, it comes. So to compare Shakespeare, who has a process of editing, to a revelation that comes back in a specific time period, and we know this by way of asbab al-nuzul and other things, you can't compare the two based on that very fact. There was no second editing, third editing, how does this formulate? In other words, when a person is going to compose something, they have to kind of go back over and over again when they're going to compose something, right? Yes, some people can compose poetry right off the bat, and the Arabs were known for that. In many cases, an incident would happen, and they would come up with a poem. But if someone wants to perfect their poetry, there's going to be an editing process, which Shakespeare has. He has a whole history of studying language, studying rhetorical devices, for instance. We know Shakespeare studied that for years before his poems actually became something of value within the Western literary tradition. All right? So you're comparing apples and oranges. Yeah, let's get a mic over here.
Wouldn't abrogation also count as editing?
Sorry?
Wouldn't abrogation of like certain verses count as editing?
In a sense, it could, but the other thing we're saying is that it's not only that it was on the spot, but it was sustained over 23 years, right? And so if there's consistency over 23 years, you've got another problem when it comes to comparing to Shakespeare, because that consistency isn't found in Shakespeare. Okay? Because look, human beings over time, when you age, you experience things differently in a different way, and you're going to express things differently, right? Any author, you have a book that's written when they were like, let's say 20 versus a book they're written when they're 50, you're going to notice a bunch of different things. Addition in vocabulary, for instance, right? So things that I wrote when I was in my 20s and things that I wrote right now are drastically different, right? Just from the fact that I have a greater vocabulary usage. I know other things. I have different experiences that formulate how I'm going to express things, right? That's not the case with the Qur'an, because there's a consistency, a stylistic consistency, right? Any other questions? Right, and that's a good point too. Linguistic editing versus editing of content, right? So yeah, I think that's a good point. Jazakallah khair. So editing meaning like, when we talk about abrogation, this is content. But I think, brother, the issue is that that would also fall under linguistic editing as far as the Qur'an goes. So I'm not sure if that point would, because there could be both. So, Allahu Alam. Okay. All right. So therefore, to simply put, the only option is that it comes from Allah. All right? Now, bolstering evidence for this, the text itself is telling you it's coming from Allah. Right? So then it's like, okay, well, the author lied. You know, bolstering evidence, right? Tanzilu min Rabbil Alameen. It is a revelation from the creator of the Lord of the heavens and the earth, and so on, right? Over and over and over again. It's making a claim. So not that that's the primary evidence, but by way of deductive reasoning, we've seen that the Qur'an, the best explanation is that it comes from Allah. All right? So that's the argument in a, as best as I can put it. Any questions about that? Okay, let's get the mic here.
Is it possible if you can go back a few slides?
No. No, I'm just kidding. Which slide do you want to go to?
Go more forward. Yeah, that one.
Okay. That was it?
No, another one after that.
So you want me to go back one more?
No. This one's it, and I need you to go to another slide after that.
Oh, okay. So which slide is that?
It's like the one about Prophet.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to write it down?
Yeah.
All right, let me... Jazakallah khair for the question. All right. No, it's good. All right. Let me connect with our sisters, inshallah. Inshallah. Sisters, do you guys have any questions? I think I can hear you guys. Assalamu alaikum, sisters. No questions. Okay, mashallah. Jazakallah khair. Okay. Any questions on this end? All right, can we get the mic over there?
Can you elaborate on abrogation?
So abrogation is a phenomenon that is found in the Qur'an, right? And so we know that ayat have been abrogated. That's not an issue for us. When you say elaborate, do you want me to get into the entire field of nasikh or mansukh and things like that, or? Sorry? Yeah, changing of the qibla is a good one. Ta'wil al-qibla. So initially, the Muslims were told to pray towards Bayt al-Maqdis, and this was fine while they were in Mecca, because they could face the Kaaba and face Bayt al-Maqdis. But when they migrate to Medina, now Kaaba would be behind them if they face Bayt al-Maqdis. So there's a changing of the qibla. So in a sense, that ruling was then abrogated to say that now the qibla is. Jazakallah khair. You got another one? Yeah, so alcohol, I don't know if we'd call it abrogation, but it was systematically it was how do I put this? The ruling was such that it was the prohibition came about piecemeal, right? So initially, it was not a direct prohibition, as I'm sure we're all familiar, that it didn't just come down and say, okay, stop drinking, right? So initially they said, okay, well, generally they said the drinking is bad, right? Then you've got concepts, okay, don't come to the salah drunk. And then you come, okay, now it's completely wrong, okay? But this again goes to the kind of the psycho-spiritual emotive state of the companions moving over time. And there's other examples of this too, by the way. So for instance, interest-bearing transactions interest actually has the same step-by-step kind of prohibition. So it wasn't initially like, okay, interest is haram right when the Prophet ﷺ comes, but it's not until very late, in fact, and by a few accounts, 9 days before the death of the Prophet ﷺ, when the ayat related to the prohibition of riba come down. The ayat that are very stern, right? فَأَذَنْ بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, and all of those that take notice of war from Allah and His Messenger for those who consume riba. So riba has the same progression as well. So you find that throughout a few different things that had rulings, inshallah. So, jazakallah khair. Okay. Okay. Okay, so the question says, basically you're saying that the isolation of the Quraysh, in particular isolated in a desert, provided them superiority of having an untouched language, unlike the Arabs that lived in Iraq. I'm assuming that means lived in Iraq afterwards. Yeah, maybe you could be saying that, but there's also a few other additional elements to that, right? Because even if when we take that into consideration, to say otherwise, and this is where I'll bring in counter testimonies, to say otherwise leads to absurd implications, like I mentioned. But yeah, if you wanted to really boil it down as one part of the argument, then yeah, you could say that, inshallah. Okay, a couple slides ago. I don't know if this is already answered. Okay, when you say that we have gone to the point of agreement that Allah exists, you are being specific to the creator characteristics of Allah and not beyond that. Am I right? Yes. So when we're talking, when we had, I don't know when this question was asked, but when we're talking about, let's say, some of the arguments about there being a creator, again, we're not saying that we are giving evidence for the entirety of what we understand as the divine, right? Because remember, the idea of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is comes from revelation. We only say about Allah what Allah has told us about Himself. So now, we're not saying that our arguments are showing that Allah is Al-Bar, right? Al-Wudud, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Those names and attributes of Allah, we know that by way of revelation. And we only describe Allah as He has described Himself, okay? But yes, there are certain elements, certain attributes that we can know. He is Al-Khaliq. So that is one we can know. So generally, the attributes or the names that are in the realm of what we call Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, His Rububiyyah, that's something you can come to a conclusion with. That's kind of what we're arguing here. But beyond that, Asma wa Sifat, that area that comes by way of revelation. Does that make sense? Inshallah. Okay, any other questions before we break for a bit, inshallah? Okay, you got a question or do you want me to go to another slide? Okay, inshallah. By the way, for whoever registered, I'm going to have them send you guys the slides. So don't worry, don't stress, inshallah. So
this is more related to like the stuff about Angel Jibreel coming to Prophet ﷺ, and like some people say that Prophet ﷺ was like schizophrenic or had like seizures and stuff. So how would you respond to that? Like he was hallucinating and all that stuff. So how would you respond to that?
So what I'll do is I'll refer you guys to a chapter in the Divine Reality. Remember, there's a lot of stuff we don't cover. So there's an entire chapter on the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And that too forms a type of deductive argument, right? That argument is that there's three options when it comes to understanding who the Prophet ﷺ was. That he makes a claim that he's a prophet, so either he's lying, he's telling the truth, or he's deluded. So you're asking about the deluded part. So in the book, it goes over various reasons as to why delusion could not be an option, all right? To give one example, so in other words, he's deluded in thinking that he's a prophet, but in reality, he's not a prophet. That's what we mean by deluded, okay? Now, one example would be, for instance, when his son Ibrahim died, the Prophet's son died, there was an eclipse that happened. And many of the Sahaba, they came out and they said, oh, the son of the Prophet ﷺ died, and the sun and the moon are even in mourning, right? Like they're even feeling sad. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, when he came out, he said that the sun and the moon, they don't eclipse for the birth or death of any man, but rather they're just a sign, and we should pray. Okay, now I'm just paraphrasing. So let's take these three options very quickly, all right? So, was he a liar? Was he lying to the claim? If he was, his motivation would have been like, this is a grand opportunity for me to say, yeah, the sun and the moon have eclipsed because my son died, because I'm a prophet, all right? If he was deluded, in other words, he thinks he's a prophet, but in reality he's not, he also would have said, oh, this must be a sign, right? Because he's deluded that my son died, right? And therefore the sun and the moon are eclipsed. But that statement that he makes runs completely antagonist to both of those options. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. All right? So you deductively, this is one example. There's many examples throughout the Sira, right? So in other words, you conclude by, deductive necessity that he was telling the truth. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And there's a whole chapter in the Divine Reality for those of you who have the book. For those of you who don't, you can download it for free as a PDF online if you're interested. All right? On the Sapiens Institute website. And I'll bring that up when we go for break. You can download all of our books for free. Obviously, if you want the actual physical copy, I think there's a cost to that. Can we get the mic over here, inshallah? Oh, yeah. Okay, so let me just take his and then we'll come back.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Quran did have some answers to to some of these questions, same questions. أم يقولون شاعر نتربص به ريب المنون بل افتراه مجنون. All of these things are addressed.
Yeah.
But then if we are addressing the atheists of today, we have to address other things. In addition to that, in addition to the standard questions which do repeat and do come.
No.
What is additional are questions like the ones produced by this brother.
Yeah.
The issue of progress. That now we are in the 21st century, we are more progressed people. Who cares about those people in the desert 700 years? They didn't know anything. What language, what? I don't think so. We have progress now. So we have to address what is different in mentality now than then. And then we have to address also issues like, these people of religion, that caused all this destruction. And if God has all this power, then why this evil exists? So, I mean, what are the new challenges that are brought by atheists today that are not clearly addressed at that time?
Okay. So the last one you mentioned about the problem of evil, I think we did a session on that. I don't know if you were here for that, right? And there's more details in the book, right? Obviously, we have a limitation of time, but I think we addressed that pretty thoroughly, right? In a very robust way. And that's why when we are presenting these particular topics, we're referring to a lot of work that's done within academia, right? So even if someone wants to say like, who cares about what those people said? That's not a very rational or let's say modern way of approaching a topic. Like, they were just stupid. I mean, what kind of that's not an erudite or academic way of approaching anything. Those stupid people. But fine, if you think they're stupid, that's your own bias. But why? Like, I'm engaging with you on a level, and taking your pre-assumptions, right? One of the main things that I always say is that when you're having a conversation, you always have to find where is the inconsistency in the statement that the person's making to you. And you will definitely find it. 100%, right? So again, who cares about those foolish people back then? Okay, but that's not a very erudite or academic or refined way of analyzing anything. You would never analyze your own history like that, right? Who cares what that foolish man Thomas Jefferson said? Right? What does he know about political philosophy? Okay, if I made a statement like that, like, wow, you're such that's not a good way of analyzing anything, So I think we just have to, I understand what you're saying. There are kind of, we have progress and things like that, but I would hold them to account on even the philosophical concept of progress. Who says we have progress? What do you mean by progress, right? Is it only material progress, but that's based on your worldview, that you can only have material progress within philosophical naturalism? I'm questioning that worldview, right? Because progress for me would mean something that transcends material things which don't even give life meaning. So I'm addressing something that is way deeper than simple material progress, right? So again, what I'm telling a lot of us is when you are in these conversations, don't just accept the paradigm that they're giving you. Question the question, right? Play the role of the skeptic, right? The philosophical skeptic, and say, hold on a second, why is that true? Like, wait, you can't just make an assertion. Because what happens is, things in our society, we've just accepted them to be true. All humans are equal. Okay, but wait a minute, how? Under your worldview, how is that true? Like, how do you justify that, right? Okay, we own ourselves. How do you even justify that? Okay, you say self-ownership, like libertarians, for instance. Libertarians are very, within the liberal framework, you've got libertarians, right? They say, no taxes, minimum state, all these things, based on the concept of self-ownership. There are certain inconsistencies that arise, right? That run antagonists to the very human project. All right, I'll give you an interesting one. Libertarian says we own ourselves, taxes are a form of slavery, right? I work for my money. If the government forces me to pay, they're forcing me to work for them. Do you see how that works, right? And that's what taxes are. They're a type of slavery. And we are free. We own ourselves. That's why they say minimum taxes, okay? Now, the problem arises is that if you claim self-ownership, you come into some very sticky situations. And I'll give you one. In Germany, a few years ago, there was a person who put an ad in the paper, all right? And this ad in the paper was advertising that I would like to eat somebody. Okay? 200 people replied to the ad. Now, this guy, he interviewed 32 of those people. Okay? This is insane, but it's true, right? You can look it up. After interviewing 32 people, he selects one guy. Okay? Now, the one guy, and all of this he does it on video. He has consent. He says, are you willing to be eaten? And he wasn't even paying them, by the way. They wanted to be eaten for the sheer experience of being eaten. Okay? So now, this happens. The authorities show up. He's got a freezer full of, whatever, John or whatever, whoever was the guy. And so they arrest him. Now, the problem arises is at the time, Germany did not have anti-cannibalism laws. So what do you charge the guy with, right? But philosophically, if you own yourself and he was consenting and you're consenting, how does the government come in and say that you're not allowed to do that? Do you get what I'm saying? So you always have to question the question, what are the philosophical pre-assumptions that you're coming to the table with, right? Always do that. And what you're going to find, kufr always contradicts itself. There are always going to be, there's always, whether it's liberalism, feminism, Christianity, atheism, it will always contradict itself, hands down. You just got to dig deep enough and just find it, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and take a break, because I know we've been at it for some time, and then we'll come back and we'll do, and I know the sisters have a few questions, but I'm going to table those until after the break, and we'll start with the questions from the sisters, bi'idhnillah. So let's go ahead and take a quick 10-minute break, but please keep it at 10 minutes because I kind of messed everyone up last time by not having the slides and things like that. So try to make it 10 minutes. Jazakallah khair. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.